Welcome to the first Displacing Politics lecture. We've got Paul Higate, Professor of Conflict and Security at the University of Bath, and he works on militarism, violence, and gender loosely. And he's going to be speaking about beyond illusions of militarized violence and empire, resilience, heterotopia, and made in the Royal Navy. And we've got Elizabeth Kinne as respondent. She works at the American University in Paris here and looks at gender and the military and is working on women in the military currently in the US, right? Is that sort of? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, without further ado, I'll give it over to Paul. Paul, I think will speak for about 45 minutes, and then you have about 10 to 15 minutes for comments, and then we'll open it up to you guys. Okay?
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here in a new tropical climate versus the UK. It's just really nice and warm in Paris. Today, obviously see the title there, and you are the guinea pig audience, so this has never been presented before. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but you'll have to bear with me as we kind of move through some of the arguments I'm trying to make. Maybe before I get going, just a few kind of words on how I've got to this point and a little bit of background. So you may be aware that the original title of the talk was something quite different. I can't even remember it, I'm sorry about that. But so it has evolved quite significantly. I've been working on questions of resilience, and it's taken me in a particular direction, a direction that I completely unexpected direction, leading me to Foucault, concept of heterotopia, which you may or may not have come across. We will be talking about that anyway. And I want to look at the concept of resilience and heterotopia together, and what they can do as a kind of concept to help us think through how violence and empire's past, whatever, gets kind of obfuscated, gets attention from it is diverted to something quite different. And I'm using the context of the British Made in the Royal Navy advertising campaign, which I think is a quite kind of interesting and quite seductive set of adverts which help us to work through how these processes take place where violence and militarisation kind of slip from view. Okay, so the argument I'm going to try to make today, and with your help hopefully improve, is to think about heterotopia, which I'll be coming to kind of giving you concept definitions as we go through, but think about how heterotopia requires resilient subjects, resilient actors. So in Foucault's work, he doesn't really explore or examine in any real depth the extent to which actors are constituted as subjects of a particular kind within this kind of heterotopic space, which I'll be kind of coming to shortly. So my interest really is in shifting the emphasis from the space of heterotopia to subject identity formation or constitution, I suppose, in Foucauldian terms, through these discourses that circulate in these kinds of spaces. The other thing that Foucault tends not to do, so my aim is really to push his work a little bit further than is currently the case, is to think about the politics of these processes. And so when you think, when we look at the advertising campaigns and we think through this lens of this kind of heterotopia, this resilience nexus, if you like, what we begin to see is how violence is occluded. So the nexus, I call the nexus, the heterotopia resilience nexus, obscures not just the militarised violence, which is obviously at the heart of one of the key branches of the British Armed Forces, but it also includes the historical context of the Royal Navy, which is implicated in things like slave trade, for example, and empire more broadly. Okay, quite tricky to do a lot of justice to his concept in the time I have available, but let's just run through some of the key kind of criteria that he outlined in order to define what we might understand a heterotopia to be. So he has 6 principles, and he goes through each and every one, giving us a kind of hint at what a particular heterotopic space might look like? So he starts off his first principle, what he calls a space of crisis. So he refers in his short essay of a space to primitive spaces, so-called sacred or forbidden spaces. So he talks about the example of menstruating women who are probably sent to a hut during the time they menstruate. They're kind of isolated, ostracized, and this space of heterotopia is, and we can talk about this later if you're interested, the space between dystopia and utopia. Now the difference between, for example, utopia and heterotopia, which is what Foucault's particularly interested in, it doesn't really talk about dystopia, is that heterotopias are real spaces and utopias are kind of abstract spaces or idealistic spaces, is another way to put it. So he's looking at these real spaces which are kind of outside of society, but reflect in many ways the social dynamics, practices, prejudices, constitutions of subjects of various kinds that exist in wider society, but they are bracketed out, if you like. Now, what he talks about in this first principle, the space of crisis, is there's been a shift from a space of crisis to what he calls a space of deviation. So psychiatric hospital is a good example, prison is something else, and he also talks about military barracks in respect of space of deviation. So military barracks are total institutions, closed off from wider society, a kind of third space, if you like, which is not utopic in that way, but it's a kind of real space, but very much demanding particular practices from its subjects. The second principle he refers to here is the changing nature of a heterotopia's meaning and function. And it should be, I mean, for those of you who are familiar with Foucault, it's quite difficult sometimes, it's probably in part down to the translation, but he's quite difficult to conceptualize. He's nice to think with, but to operationalize in more concrete terms, substantive terms, for theory testing, etc., he's quite tricky. So I'm trying to think with him rather than think of these principles as very substantive in their kind of makeup. So here I talk about the cemetery on the second one. So cemeteries were at one time located in the heart of the city, but now they're kind of on the periphery, and the meanings attached to them have shifted. So they're much more functional space rather than a sacred space. Third principle he talks about is the juxtaposition of several incompatible spaces, or spaces which contain reflections of and suggestions of other spaces. So a theatre or a cinema is a good example. You go to a cinema, you sit, you watch the film. The film is obviously referring to all sorts of other spaces. So you're juxtaposing a whole bunch of different spaces in one space. Pardon me. So that's his idea there of a kind of several, sometimes incompatible, sometimes less so, but a kind of, trying to think, a juxtaposition of different spaces in one time in one place. The fourth principle is much more referring to the kind of temporal rather than spatial. So he talks here about slices in time. And just to lift some of the words he's got in the essay there, he says, when men arrive at an absolute break with their traditional time. So there's a sense of ephemerality, transitoriness, there's suggestions of movement, there's this kind of sense that these spaces are fleeting. They're not fixed in any particular time. Now at this stage, this is all very abstract. I'm hoping a bit later on to kind of show you what work they can do, the heterotopic work it can do when we apply it to a concrete case. Fifth one there, and this is the question really of heterotopic spaces are not always easy to access, or rather some people are allowed to access them and some people are not. Okay? So in certain situations, the military could be a good example actually, you need to pass through certain stages of training, etc., in order to be allowed to access a particular kind of space. And finally, the sixth principle there, which again, quite difficult really to operationalize, is what he calls the space of illusion. Maybe a space of fantasy, so he talks about brothels as an example, and he also juxtaposes those with spaces of compensation. So he talks about the colonies, and he talks about how this sixth principle gets us to think about how particular spaces are very ordered and meticulously organised in relation to the more chaotic spaces of wider society. Now, I was really not looking forward to presenting this slide because it is so abstract, so bear with me and let's see what we can do when we put these things together. Okay, so I've spoken a little bit about the kind of heterotopia that Foucault's outlined and thinking a little bit about how abstract that might be. And now I come to the second part of the kind of concept that I'm trying to develop really, and that's the question of resilience. So you're probably quite familiar with the concept of resilience. It kind of had its heyday, I guess, a few years ago now, often with regard to developing resilience in particular populations who have endured catastrophe or disaster. So refugee populations, for example, could be a good instance of where resilience is needed. I won't go through this quote in detail, but just to pick out a couple of the things that I think are really important for what I'm trying to do here. So actors need to become more responsive. So it's a process of learning. And in the literature on resilience, you see the notion, I don't like it, but it's the notion of bounce back, of coming back from a difficult situation to actually overcome it and learn and thrive and prepare yourself for the next difficult, the next challenge on the horizon. This is a question of adaptability, of course. So the actor in this sense is a learning organism, a learning subject who is constantly trying to better her or himself or prepare themselves for the catastrophe that is coming, Brexit, no not really, but the catastrophe that is coming and how we can prepare ourselves for that in various ways. Okay, so that's resilience. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that I'm interested in looking at the Royal Navy advertising campaigns as a kind of example of where this resilience heterotopia nexus can allow us to see what is currently been obscured by the nature of the advert. So this refines, if you like, or narrows down the concept of resilience to a much more focused set of understandings. So, at the crux of this doctrine, this is the British Army doctrine, a British soldier's resilience is founded on the interplay of two vital assets. So number one, the body, and number two, the equipment. Now the question here is, the body must be able to manipulate the equipment highly effectively in order to be part of a fighting force. And of course, when we think about the Royal Navy, the principle is the same. It's a fighting force, and the idea is that they're able to use their equipment highly effectively, unless, towards operational effectiveness. Otherwise, there are real issues about how useful those bodies can be. Now, of course, this is a question of use of violence. So bodies within this relationship with their equipment are trained to use violence of an instrumental kind. And in many ways, we could say they're being embodied to disembody. That's the aim. So soldiers, military personnel, in one way or another, and at close proximity, or if we think of drone warfare, in a remote sense, are being embodied in some sense to use violence to disembody the enemy other. Now, this process of embodying and developing resilience in the militarized subject is not just a case, of course, of affecting a materiality which results in effective use of violence. It's also a highly representational act. So I just want to stop very briefly, and this will become clear when I show the adverts, how important it is to think about the representational aspect of this embodiment. So again, I'm not going to read all of this, but just pick out some of the key kind of transformative aspects of embodiment, if you like, in this militarized context. So, first of all, there's a question of pride. So these new bodies, if you like, fashioned within militarized contexts are encouraged to develop a particular kind of pride, confidence, ability, potential, capacity, again, resonating with the concept of resilience, which leads in turn to a new sense of self. And for those of you, I mean, pretty much all of us in the room, in fact, you may have even gone through military service yourself, the body that comes out, or the person that comes out at the end of military training, is quite different to the one that went in. It's a transformative process. And this particular quote by a colleague of mine, Jesse Cohen-Sieber, looks in more detail at the body as a kind of surface, as a text which is transformed. It talks about finely toned muscles, posture. The military works to produce a new body with a new identity. And again, the question of confidence comes back, and all of this will become clear later why I'm teasing these things out. Obviously, the question of weapons, and in fact, sex appeal. So soldiers are canonized as these sexy bodies, attractive bodies by some. We might not agree with that, but wider culture often propagates those kinds of representational practices. Okay. So, just before we move on to this, the question of the sea, which seems to come out of nowhere, and I'll explain why we've got this slide here. We have resilient bodies, militarized resilient bodies. We have heterotopias, these spaces of exception. And now we turn, as we move much more towards the substantive case that I'm interested in examining in more detail, the question of the sea. So I'm interested in the Royal Navy. Now I think the Royal Navy is a really interesting case because unlike the Air Force and unlike the Army, though of course they are pitched against different kinds of environmental challenges. So for the Army, obviously it's being ground-based, overcoming land, moving through land effectively, moving over terrain, etc. And of course the Air Force is ultimately about mastering air power, conquering the air, having a kind of controlling presence in the air. The Navy, I think, has a particular context which in some ways seems much more symbolic. And it has spurned, a wealth of literature from Moby Dick through to all sorts of other kind of portrayals of the sea and what the sea means. So I think the sea is a particularly interesting context when we think about the question of resilience. So there is a question about how resilience plays out against the backdrop of what I've got here, the infinity of the sea. So this is a quote from Nietzsche, which is in Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic. So again, I don't want to go into too much detail exactly, with the nuances of the quote, but a few things to pull out. When we think about resilience, and you can see there the quote, but when you think about resilience and the demands it makes on the subject in question, what's really kind of poignant perhaps and interesting is this idea of feeling homesick for the land. So this notion, this idea, almost poetic kind of idea of the infinity of the sea, places very particular demands on the subjects in question, and indeed demands very particular kinds of resilience that you don't necessarily, arguably, see in the Air Force or the Army, although you do in slightly different ways. But we can talk about what I'm trying to get across with a particular case. There is no longer any land. You are on the sea and you are at the whim of the sea. And it's a pretty dangerous place. Okay. So now we come a little bit more inching towards putting together questions of resilience and heterotopia. So this quote is used in regard to heterotopia, but it gets us to think about what I was trying to convey at the beginning of the presentation, and that is a question of how heterotopias demand resilient selves. So heterotopias draw us out of ourselves in peculiar ways. They inaugurate a difference and challenge the space in which we may feel at home. So heterotopias are not home. Heterotopias are the foil against which home might be constituted. Okay, they are the place in which we might feel alienated. They are the place in which we are far removed from familiarity. There is no pure form of heterotopia, but different combinations. They're disturbing spatial temporal units. So this is a case not just of the space, but as I mentioned before, and I think it's Foucault's third principle, a question of slices in time, a question of contradictory and juxtaposed temporal rhythms. So this again is a question, and I've highlighted the interiority, getting back to the requirements that are placed upon a resilient subject to adapt, to bounce back, to negotiate, to engage, to succeed in these spaces of heterotopia. So I thought it might be helpful just to return very quickly to the principles that I mentioned at the outset in terms of Foucault's heterotopia, to think about the questions of resilience. So immediately you can see questions of crisis and deviance in a much more substantive sense demand resilient selves. Boarding school, clearly, you can think of Tom Brown's School Days, and the requirement for a resilient self in those contexts is quite clear. Prison, again, a resilient self to negotiate the kind of vicissitudes of prison life. Shifts in meaning and function. So again, this question of the cemetery, if we extrapolate that to the confusing and ever-changing situation in which we find ourselves, and it might not necessarily be a heterotopic space. We work in universities and we're constantly bombarded with different regimes, different ways of doing things, different ways of accounting, different metrics. And again, this is the question of having to adapt. So negotiating spaces of difference and contradiction linked to the second point there, complex temporalities, as I've already mentioned, barriers to access. So to be accepted into these particular heterotopic spaces, you have to pass through certain challenges. I mentioned military training, clearly requiring resilient self of a particular kind. And again, living a very regimented life in the colonies, as Foucault would see it, does similarly require a particular kind of resilience. So just to sum up there, demanding adaptability in order to overcome adversity, and what I call increased horizons of agentic possibility, in other words, adaptability to unknown, difficult to predict scenarios. However, just to say they are all allied to a military functionality. So unlike civilian life, where the horizons of resilience are much more open, in the end, the military wants you to do certain things, and you will be within a chain of command and a hierarchy, and the things that you do are the very things that the military requires, and not much else outside of that. So it's a particular kind of militarized resilience. Okay, so we talked about the sea, we talked about resilience, and now we talk about the boat or the ship. So this is a question really of why, in my reading, I decided to pursue this question of heterotopia in the boat, or what I call the ship. And I think we can talk about the distinction, but essentially a ship is a vessel upon which you can put a boat. It's just bigger, is what I've got from Wikipedia and places. Good source. Okay, so the question here is, for Foucault, quite interestingly, for him, the exemplary heterotopic space is the ship. The boat is a floating piece of space, a place without a place, that exists by itself, that is closed in on itself, and at the same time is given over to the infinity of the sea. And that, it goes as far as the colonies in search of the most precious treasures. It is the great instrument of economic development and the greatest reserve of the imagination. The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. So here we see Foucault saying, well, actually, though he's given us the principles, 6 principles, and has provided instances of how he sees these heterotopic spaces being comprised, for him, in the end, the ship is the ultimate, or the exemplary heterotopic space. So immediately when I read this, I thought, great, because this helps to bring together questions around abstract concepts and Foucault's sometimes quite elusive theorising to something much more substantive in the case of the ship. So, oh, okay, let's use the ship as the way to investigate, in a much more substantive sense, some of the issues we're interested in. It's also quite intriguing for me, at least, that Foucault's use of the ship or the boat has almost entirely been missed by scholars more generally. There are one or two papers I've found which develop his question, his notion of the ship or the boat as an exemplary heterotopic space. And when they do that, they tend to focus on the cruise ship. And there are a couple of papers focus on the cruise ship as a heterotopic space. Now, I think, looking at what Foucault is trying to get across here, he wasn't interested, or he wasn't invoking cruise ships, but merchants' vessels maybe, or Royal Naval vessels, or military vessels, because these were the ships, these were the ways of intervening in the colonies, which were much more oriented towards not just leisure, but obviously economic development. And the kind of colonial imperial conquests were made possible by the British Royal Navy with its long history and imitating such practices. So I think this is, for me, really gives us the thing which propels the paper forward potentially to think about how we can use Foucault in a much more kind of substantive way. Right, now I have, okay, that's a lot of the boring stuff out of the way. So, now it gets much more exciting because I'm going to show you some of these adverts that I've been alluding to throughout. There are a total of 12, and they're about a minute in length. So, what I've tried to do today is, rather than show you them first, and then think about the analysis, obviously I've done it the other way around, we will have some analysis after. But I'm hoping with what I've said, we will go into these adverts well primed to do some of the readings that I think are important, the preferred meanings, if you like, embodied within these adverts. There are a series of 12 adverts. You can see what I've been looking at. There's a series of 12 adverts here. I'm not going to show all of them. They're about a minute long. They're very high tempo. They're very quick. They're very kind of short, spliced together scenes. So I'll ask you to bear with me and see if you can get from these what I've been trying to drive at. So I'll show a few together and then we'll have a little discussion.
Said my first word at 1. Kicked off the stabilizers at 4. United mad by 7. Bored at 11. First black iron girlfriend at 14. I left school at 16. Broke my arm, broke the bank. 18, about nights in the castle. But then I stopped pulling pints and started pushing myself. I upped my game, made a leap. I learned to think on my feet and off them. I put my life in the hands of others and held their lives in mine. I left home, I wrote home, I found a new home. I did things I never dreamed I would and overcame things I never thought I could. The elements, the distance, the fears, doubts, and all 7 continents. Sure, I was born in Carlisle, but I was made in the Royal Navy. Start your journey, search Made in the Royal Navy.
It all comes down to this basic question. Can I improve me? We are all, in various ways, self-seeking, lacking in courage, lacking in wisdom, but there is this urgent feeling that I must improve me. Now you may say, I need some help in this process. All right. Mind over mind. You will begin to find out that learning is good for you. And the great things that you do are really happenings. That seems to be something like progress.
A women's place. I decided it was up to me where that was. And it was in the Navy. Yep, I felt it. Said that I wanted, then I get it. Told me you're coming, then I'm ready. Ship looking rocky, but I'm steady. Yep, I felt it. Said that I wanted, then I get it. Told me you're coming, then I'm ready. Ship looking rocky, but I'm steady. So hear me out, let it register. Going all out for the minister. And the seminar preaching that word, I'm not into a foreigner. Chasing that dream till my team looking merrier. Hungry for long, so the grind's looking scarier. Couldn't be me, and that makes me feel happier. Yep, I felt it. Told me you're coming, then I'm ready. Ship looking rocky, but I'm steady.
When I grew up, we had a lot of opportunities to better yourself. I just thought, right, I need to do something with my life. Since I've joined the Navy, I've never looked back. I've always set myself goals, whether it be my first time in an aircraft, getting my first medal, making the rugby team. I've managed to achieve more than I ever thought I would. All my friends think I'm lucky that I get all these qualifications and I get to travel all over the world. But I always tell them that I chose to join the Navy. Anyone can do it. What makes me proud is making others proud of me. The more other job would you get to play at Twickenham in front of 82,000 people. I was born in Bridgend, but I was definitely made in the Royal Navy.
Okay, let's leave these here for now. And return to the some of the kind of analysis really from the videos. Okay, so I think the videos are extremely rich. There are a number of different ways in which you can take these forward in terms of analysis, and I've got here gender, race, class, and age. I mean, I've given the presentation, given the nature of the paper I'm writing, it's quite difficult to develop all of these lines of inquiry. I mean, but obviously they're rich in that sense. Now, what I think is interesting really, and I would like to tease out, is the question of, obviously I've mentioned resilience, but just to put a little bit of flesh on the bones really, if you like, in light of the videos itself. So there's something very interesting about how resilience is allied or married to questions of self-actualization. So you will recall Ben's story, which is the very first video I showed you, of a hopeless, futile, irrelevant, failed civilian existence, which is juxtaposed with that of the Navy, where the individual, the subject in question, can move into this amazing space of the ship as the kind of key metaphor, the key symbol, and become self-actualized, fulfill potential, and become highly adaptable towards resilience, towards the exemplary resilient subject. So obviously you have here the question of civilian versus military resilience, or lack of resilience in civilian life, that are placed in a hierarchy. In fact, civilian life is generally seen as really second best, and you should, if you at all possible, the way out of that is obviously to join the Navy. The role of the body in those videos, as I've already kind of mentioned, in terms of resilience and military resilience, they're very interesting, highly embodied videos, or rather the body is a key dimension. And also in the case of Madhu, the black subject, if you like, his cognitive resilience is facilitated and fostered as well. There's distinct, I mean, we can talk about some kind of theoretical backdrop to this Cartesian split between these things in these videos. So the ship is a space of crisis and change in many ways. and I'll talk about that in a second in regard to the aircraft carrier's more political aspect of this presentation. But the changes in meaning in the ship do demand resilience, and they demand resilience from those moving between different continents, you're at peace, at war, you're involved in different activities. Again, this is the changing context of the ship's life, if you like. Now, going back to Foucault, I mentioned as one of the first principles the question of the question of either crisis or deviance. And for many, from the outside, if you like, the military actor is mythologized in part because he or she has been trained to use violence, to disembody, as I've said. That's a kind of ultimate taboo, of course, the taking of another's life, and therefore in many respects they are deviant subjects, albeit canonized, lionized and revered in these contexts. Obviously you can't just access a ship and become a sailor, so again we have that particular Foucauldian principle at play. Partitioned and regimented, talked about the kind of brothel as a particular space of fantasy, but also in opposition to a colony as a regimented place, and again we see that at the end. And also I think what's very interesting, I haven't shown you the other videos, there's quite an emphasis on the return, so the return of the sailor, as I said, the transformed actor to civilian life, normally to meet their parents in their uniform. So again, some of the things we saw in the video, Ben, I overcame things I never thought I could, the distance, this was the first one I showed you, all 7 continents. So again, this incredible transitory ability to be, to juxtapose all of these places, slices in time as they move across. And again, I mentioned Gareth here, jumping to the swimming pool, and this kind of way of disorienting through messing with the kind of temporal and spatial kind of tropes. I didn't have a chance to show you Ali, but his role is a submariner, and again we're looking at a really interesting instance of heterotopia as a very, very kind of isolated and cut off space. And if anybody's seen the German film Das Boot, submarine, about the submarine, that's, you get that whole feel from it. And Chantel, who's a chef on one of the ships, again she takes her kitchen around the world. So this is the idea of movement through time and space. The heterotopic space is one which doesn't have a particular location. It has a reality, but it has a very placelessness dimension to it. So these individuals are born in a place, but made, and you notice the catchline there, made in the Royal Navy, made in the ethereal context of the Royal Navy, localizable but placeless, hierarchies and superlatives, civilian life is futile, ship life is fertile, though in actuality power is illusory because, as I said earlier, they're in a chain of command, they're very much at the whim of what the organisation wants them to do. Okay, we've got quite a lot here, we're not going to get through it, so let's move towards wrapping up. Okay, so in a sense, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the key reasons for this, one of the key potential values of the nexus is to get us to think about, well, where is the violence? We didn't see any violence there, of course. There was nobody being shot, there was no flesh, there was no blood, there was no dismemberment, there were no bodies floating about, blown up, torn apart. There was no enemy, in fact. The enemy was entirely absent. The absence presence of anything related to the raison d'etre of the military is quite intriguing. So the seduction of resilience, the seduction of the ship as heterotopia diverts us from, it elides, if you like, militarised violence, histories of empire. And the ship actually is quite an interesting case because not only is it heterotopic, but it's framed to its audience, to the potential enlistee into the Navy, as a utopia, as a place where there are friends, there's amazing life. There is nothing on that ship in any way, at any point, that speaks to anything other than self-actualization, peak experience, in Maslow's terms, realization of the self. So the argument really that I'm trying to make is it does, the nexus, if you like, or thinking about these things as the kind of resilient subject within heterotopia, does help us to bring the politics of these adversaries into sharp relief. And the question of crisis, which I've kind of not focused on too much, the crisis, as I wanted to mention actually, was really in terms of thinking about the Royal Navy and thinking, for those of you that are familiar, of the two new Royal Naval aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince William. A total cost, I think it's of 40 billion over the next 10 years. It's a lot of money. And I think the crisis for me in this heterotopic space, if you like, the crisis is about a lost empire, an attempt to regain status on the world stage, etc. So again, the ship is performing these kinds of powerful symbolic, potentially failing, because there's a lot of critique of the new aircraft carrier fleet, and they still haven't got aircraft, so they're pretty ineffective as they stand. So, okay, I think hopefully I can wrap up. So here's a picture, actually, William Turner's with this, called the slave ship. I just wanted to show you this because I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I've mentioned as well during the presentation that the Royal Navy had an active role in the slave trade. And I wanted to use this image because I think it's extremely potent in terms of reflecting the sea, the infinity of the sea, the heterotopic space of the ship. And also, finally, picture's always good at this stage of the presentation. Here are the two new aircraft carriers at the top. Highly evocative creations, structures, versus what I think, this is purely subjective, I suppose, something altogether less exciting, and that's RAF Typhoon and a British Army tank. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening.
So I'll try to formulate just some comments and remarks as I respond to Paul. First of all, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm familiar with your scholarship, and I've really enjoyed reading about your treatments of gender and peacekeeping. Your most recent book on Africa and private security study companies is extraordinarily compelling. It's 2017? Just came out? So I'm doing the book plug because Paul won't. It was published by Zed Books, and it's a remarkable and very innovative piece on private security companies in the military, particularly in Africa, which might also go towards the heterotopic notion. I think there could be
quite elastic as a concept.
So it's nice to see the new direction that your scholarship is taking as well. Is this a new book project?
This has come out of nowhere. Literally in the last few weeks, I've just got thinking about this. So I think it. Sometimes you have these ideas and you think, oh, this is great, and then it runs out of steam pretty quickly, and then you end up thinking, oh, that's a complete waste of time. But I have a sense that this might have more legs and go somewhere. I don't know where. It's going to be a paper in a way, that's for sure.
It's going to be a paper. Okay, all right. I'm really interested in how you use the notion of the space of heterotopia. And as I was listening to your talk, and you said something about creating very particular subjects in very particular spaces. And I couldn't help but thinking of Foucault's work on technologies of self. I think that a lot of what is happening in these videos goes towards that creation of self, because you talk about self-actualization and this move towards resilience. The disciplining of the body and the mind, this idea that these are deviant subjects who are being trained to perpetrate state-sanctioned violence, and what we kind of take away from these is really the leisurely aspect of this existence. A lot of the shots look like they're tourists. Which I find really compelling. Right? Part of it looks like it's a music video. So there's definitely a superposition of genres, and the concept of heterosocial or homosocial spaces between men and then between women, particularly in Louise's video, which I thought was really interesting. And I thought perhaps you could talk about that a little bit more. I was also curious as to the distinction between different types of vessels because of the gendered experience of submarines versus the experience of the aircraft carrier. Because very often questions of birthing come up in submarines and sex segregation that are kind of tricky, and the way in which the submarine might represent a different type of heterotopia because of its enclosed nature, versus the idea of the ship and the openness of the ship and the relationship between air and sky as well. What that could indicate. Because I'm also interested in gender, and particularly I look at questions of women in the military, I thought it was really intriguing that all of these talk about being born in their place of birth, and then that they are made in the Royal Navy. So is it a masculine form of birth? Right? Is this appropriation of the maternal by this masculinized institution? And there was really this insistence on that, particularly in Ben's video when he talks about I left my mom. So you get this idea that he's going toward this masculine mother that is the Royal Navy. Let's see. So the idea of this resilient body as well, and the mutual implication of militarization and sexuality. That really comes through in the videos as well, because you see how the sexualization of each of these individuals before their transformation and after their transformation is really poignant. All of a sudden they have this kind of music video star, movie star beauty to them that is the sexualization of their body, and that's through the military. And I was also thinking about that in terms of just gendered violence in fields of operation with militaries. Is this somehow promoting forms of gendered violence, or at least not doing anything to condemn forms of gendered violence as well? I guess these are more questions than remarks, aren't they? I don't want to entirely take up the floor. But I thought that your talk just brought up so many really compelling questions that and ways of integrating Foucault in a very practical sense. You talk about how actually making Foucault actionable is difficult, going from the concept to the practicality, the analytical framework is complex, and I think you've done a really wonderful job of doing that as well. I don't have that many more comments for you. Perhaps we could start by talking about some of these aspects before turning over the floor to questions.
I mean, can I just ask, how much time do we have so that people have time to ask questions?
35 minutes.
Okay.
35 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Yes. Well, you made, brilliant. Thank you so much for the comments. They're brilliant. And this is why I really wanted to present it, because, it's the first outing of this topic presentation. So I think your question of the submarine is excellent. I'm really keen to think about that some more. It's a very particular kind of heterotopia, clearly. I tell you what I'm going to do. Can I just indulge you, everybody, for a minute? Let me show you the submarine.
Okay.
Because I think this is really fascinating. I think it's one I probably should have shown you, but I didn't.
Joined the submarines because I wanted to work with the best kit in the world. I didn't really think about the people. The first mate I made was Buster, who was a total legend. 2 became 3. A few mates turned into many. To work with the best kit, but it's not just about that anymore. I grew up with 3 brothers. Now, I've got 99 more. It doesn't matter what branch you are, what rank you are. At the end of the day, you're a Royal Navy submariner. Without a doubt, best friends in the
I was calling myself Andy. I was made in the Royal Navy.
I was made in the Royal Navy.
So I had to show that because it's so I think that's a really good question, actually, of actually further differentiating and kind of disaggregating these spaces, because of course Foucault was again pretty broad in his concept of the ship, boat, There may be something you can do in a very interesting sense. Actually, is to look in more fine-grained detail at how these heterotopias are expressed in these very nuanced kinds of ways. And I think this idea of the openness of an aircraft carrier is actually quite fascinating. And you're basically outside. Yeah. So submariners could be submerged for up to 6 months. It doesn't bear thinking about really, but that's the reality of the situation. So I think that would be really interesting. I also think the point you made, which I hadn't thought about again, which is brilliant, about the reappropriation of birthing, reappropriation of
maternity,
in regard obviously to maiden Royal Navy, and I think that's also really, really intriguing. Actually, it's something to think about. There's a kind of potency and power about how they're presenting themselves in that way. And I think every time I see the videos, I'm just reminded really of just how bizarre they are, in fact. But having said that, I think it's also important to think about these adverts alongside other adverts. So when I was at Bristol University, we had an advert for come to Bristol University and study. It's a great place. Did it show students stressing out in libraries? Of course it didn't. It showed students having fun. I mean, this is the point. It's advertising. The genre is one where you are going to show the best possible, highly selected representation of a particular form of life. So, of course, the military is not going to... However, the problem with the military, of course, is that it's involved in state-sanctioned violence. It's something quite exceptional. So, in including that violence, you are doing something quite exceptional in that moment. So, I think your point there about one of the problems really with paper as it is, or with a potential paper as it is there's actually nothing particularly original about a lot of the arguments that are going on, if you like. I mean, kind of the questions of gender are well researched in the military, of course, as we know. The question of including violence is well documented. So my challenge, if you like, is to, how far and to what extent, I suppose, the question I've got is this kind of link between resilience and heterotopia. What's it doing? So that's a kind of question for everybody, really. When you're working on something, you wonder if you're actually doing anything at all apart from going in a circle. So I'd be interested, to get a sense of how much, in those terms, value is being added to understanding of the issues through this kind of conceptual work that I've been trying to do. I think it could work, but I don't know. Yeah, I think we probably should, because it's 7 o'clock.
Okay. So maybe groups of 3. Do you want to go first? And then,
Thank you so much for the really fascinating set of questions. I actually have a question precisely about this link between resilience and heterotopia. So I'm wondering, is there a tension at all between heterotopia as a space of adaptation and resilience as a sort of characteristic of adaptability? So adaptation versus adaptability, the one being transformative and the other being a fixed characteristic in a sense. And if there is a tension, does that link in any way to the difference between identification and identity, and what that might say about this kind of all-inclusive space, all genders, all ethnicities, versus actually, as you mentioned, all the men are together, all the women are together. It's everyone's together, but everyone's still quite different. I don't know if that's interesting.
Thanks. So thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm wondering if you are going to look at what happens when this creation of the new self of this wonderful, strong person actually breaks down. What happens to the person? All these wonderful holiday shots we've seen with loads of alcohol drink going on, and isn't the alcohol maybe also an enabler into different step, especially if you're a mariner and just merged for up to 6 months. What happens with the person? Yeah.
Sorry, if I may, just to address that last point, some things are dry. So for the entire time, this knows there's an partnership.
Yeah.
And this addresses both of you. When you mentioned that this appropriation of maternal by the Navy, I'd just like to say that for the past 100 or so years, ships are female and are addressed as mum. So helicopters come back to mum. Therefore, whether it's an appropriation of the maternal or in the sense of being so far away from home, it's a sort of reaction to being so far away from home. Then you come back to the way men for hundreds of years were raised and go home to mum. I don't know if it's an intentional appropriation by the Navy or something that sailors have been doing for hundreds of years. And finally, sorry if I may, on that sexualization of the bodies that we see in that advert, I can say from experience that's not accurate. And many of my friends on Tinder and all that don't put that they're in the armed forces. And most importantly, in initial training especially, you are made healthy, but definitely not sexy. You're eating a lot of carbs, a lot of food, and you are given the opportunity to, if that is what you wish, but it is definitely more of a personal goal rather than an enforced or sort of point of pride. And also I think it's more the societal obligations and the gym-obsessed culture of the UK especially, that people push themselves to that limit and further, rather than an indoctrinated, you have to look good because you're in the Navy.
What I find fascinating in your remark, if I may respond, is that you're really making a distinction between the advertising and the sexualization of the advertising and the lived reality of the experience of being in the armed forces, and I think that's really key. And this is something that if I may, I wanted to ask Paul too, if you plan to integrate responses of individuals that had the experience of being in the military to this advertising campaign, right? To contrast the lived experience versus the idealized experience that's been used to advertise the Royal Navy. And that's, I think your comment really addresses that.
So we do 3 and then 3 more. You want?
Yeah, okay, thanks. This is why I'm here. Hopefully that, I can get some questions like this. This is great. Just starting with your question of resilience and adaptation. I'll be honest, I wasn't quite clear what you were getting at. Maybe you could rephrase it, reframe it. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a difference between adaptation as a transformative process and adaptability as a fixed characteristic. So heterotopia seems to be a transformative space.
Yeah.
Things happen, people come out the other end differently.
Yeah.
Whereas resilience seems to be a quality of preserving what you have, being able to bounce back, as you said.
Right.
Be that person and to still be that person despite the catastrophe. So I'm just wondering how do these two things fit together, and is it the same way that there's a difference perhaps between identification as a process and identity as a fixed quality?
Well, I think one way to answer this, I think, could be to say that, as you're probably aware, the critique of resilience is that it kind of, puts the weight of responsibility for various, kind of structural shortcomings, if you like, on the individual, the kind of liberal, sovereign, freely open to adapt subject. And I think if we think in those terms, this is a question it's more of an ideological question, I think, around how resilience is mobilised as a concept, as an idea. So I would probably not be thinking about, how far these individuals have really materially, demonstrably, in an empirical sense, changed. And I think what's very interesting is there is a widely held view that military training does transform people. And on one level that's true, but on another level that's problematic, actually. There is a general lack of understanding, I think, of just how far military subjects in various ways resist those processes that they are faced with. And you can, I mean, in my experience, I mean, I have a background in the military, and my experience of being in the military, my experience of doing a lot of work with the military, is that you can have individuals who've been in the military for 20 years who seem completely untouched by the experience. Whereas you can have an individual who's been in the military for a few months who's just completely militarized in that sense. So I think there is something about agency here which is really fascinating. I think the question about adaptability is really important. I'm not sure if that's much of an answer to your question, but yeah, thank you. So there was a question there about what happens when things, when individuals break down, or
yeah, when actually created some breaks
down. Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because if you look at the literature on resilience in the military context, it's really all about trying to preempt and offset and mitigate the potential onset of things like PTSD. So the idea is that you can equip people to cope with extreme challenges and to negotiate those in ways that won't affect them, that won't lead to their breakdown, but in fact will allow those subjects to continue to be, operate within that effective kind of, or to be operationally effective in the military environment. So I think, the question of breaking down has been one of the key rationales for kind of mobilising the concept of resilience and training. I mean, the British Army trains people to be resilient, has programmes to do this. I forget what the acronym is, but it has a particular one. Now that's very interesting, because there's a scholar you may be aware of, Ali Howe, who's written about how, in fact, there's in the US context, there's a link between training military personnel to be resilient and to avoid breaking down, and to save the state money in veteran affairs, the veteran services after they leave, because they're not in such a bad way. I mean, because they've been trained to be resilient. So I think here again you see the kind of ideological mobilisation of resilience in the service of the state. But resilience, generally, as I say, tends to be the way in which breakdown is avoided. When people do break down, of course, I think that's dealt with very. There are a lot of possibilities about how that's dealt with. So I recall from my own days, if you broke down, you were said to have low. You were an LMF, low moral fibre. Okay, that's how you're designated as a particular subject. So you were then ostracised and seen as weak, and there's a whole set of issues around gender, masculinity, and pride, and weakness, and expressing, failure as it might be seen. What did I have next? The ship. I'd be very interested to talk to you more about this, actually, because having been in the Air Force, I know nothing about the Navy, sadly. So a lot of this I'm kind of speculating on, but ships addressed as mum, I think that's fascinating, actually, for this, in a way. And I think the question of the tensions between the reality of military life and how it's portrayed. So I think what's interesting about the videos is the close-up, very intimate shots of bodies perspiring. It's a very intimate kind of set of representational practices going on, and there's a kind of exoticization, a kind of seductive body in train there. And I think it's, at least as far as representational practices go, I think there is a kind of sexing up of the body in that sense. Did I have any more questions?
No, but there are more. 1, 2, and is there a third? Yeah, okay. Please.
I'm a French Army officer, so thank you for the presentation. I'm at the Military Academy at the moment. I'm not sure I understood everything, so I may be sorry about some live notes, first of all. I just wanted to make some points from my experience. Maybe what we see in videos and heterotopia, as you showed us, resilience, is about engagement, which means that all together we're just one and fighting for what we have to do. So I think we need heterotopia, and it brings resilience to the group. I don't know if it makes sense, or which means that if you show violence, if you show like Daesh, you know what they do, and if you show something that you will be faced, then nobody will come. Because as you mentioned, nobody will be related to pure violence, maybe a little bit far from the objective. There is a matter of distance also, there is a matter of time. So I think the way to put together resilience and heterotopia is to show a world that a community, a military community creates, and whenever he finds himself in a very difficult situation, then he can be related to that heterotopia, where his friends are, his mates, whether they are girls or boys. And I think it's important. I understood the gender thing, but I think it's important to have a world, better world, that you create in your mind when you're confronted to difficulty, because that's part of resilience.
Thank you.
I'm uncomfortable asking this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, maybe because I just didn't hear the beginning of your talk, and so I don't know whether you address these issues, but I'm wondering to what extent you put, whether you engage with the preposition in this made in, and how the in relates to the heterotopia here, as the way you were elaborating it, and just the whole question of incorporation. And then, so when I hear this idea of the made in as a new form of birthing, I'm also asking, and these are really genuine questions because perhaps you've already addressed them, the idea of, made in China, made in France, and the fact that made in is obviously saying something about industrial processes and where value happens. And I'm just very struck, having essentially just seen the videos and then heard you talk after it, that actually the videos are kind of working as if they're gesturing to all the things that might be sources of value, i.e., music, situations of desirability, where we can feel that this is going to have a compelling force, in order to kind of create a whole, which is this whole where you would have this unstated value. So I'm just really struck that maybe this video is working by kind of gesturing towards what is to be discovered, as opposed to kind of giving the vision, so that it's kind of pointing to what we actually have to leave in order to be there. And so it's much more about being in than it is about being elsewhere, which I would obviously sort of, I'm hearing in the notion of a heterotopia. So that's, I suppose, my question is the made in.
Thanks. I was curious with the reference to Paul Milroy of the Black Atlantic, which you seem to kind of reference again towards the end. We talked about the context of Brexit and a kind of vague feeling of, post-imperial nostalgia. But more broadly as well, I'm kind of interested in the context of post-industrial capitalism, which kind of ties into what Anna Louise was saying, in the sense that transport more broadly beyond the military has become militarized. So people talk about logistics and delivery, which is obviously a military term, which is used by kind of Walmarts for just-in-time delivery, so that goods can be constantly in circulation. And this kind of ties into container ships as well, the prominence of container ships in post-industrial capitalism. The fact that kind of value production seems to happen more and more often in heterotopic spaces, circulating, rather than episodic production. So as Anna Louise highlighted, this kind of emphasis on made in is quite fascinating as a contradiction there.
You really want to test me, don't you? Thanks. Wow.
For a later question, I'd be just fascinated by Paul Milroy, especially as well.
Yeah.
You can see what was more that you seem to be thinking about.
Okay, thanks everybody. Wow, fantastic comments and questions. Yes, I think your point is really good. I mean, I think the question really here is, the challenge is to identify what kind of the social dimensions of resilience. I think that's probably what you were driving at. So in one sense, a lot of the literature is talking about resilient subjects, or kind of individualization of resilience as a quality of the actor faced with problems who can adapt and kind of overcome the next set of challenges. But of course the military is, it's a social organisation. It relies on teams, it relies on teamwork, it relies on groups of various sizes. And so yes, I think there is an interesting question to be asked about community resilience, actually, which takes you a little bit away from this kind of individualised sovereign subject that I talked about earlier on. And there is, I'm vaguely aware, but not that well up to date on the literatures that talking about, those who face natural disasters, and to have resilient communities. So there is a question of resilient communities, which I think probably needs to be played up a little bit more, because the kind of resilience that's at play here in the military context is definitely a much more social resilience, I think. So that's helpful to have that mentioned. There is a question about how the heterotopian resilience and the seduction of the body and all that kind of stuff work to occlude the violence that is obviously at the heart of military life. And the reason that I've come to that kind of point of thinking is that there is a lot of commentary within the literature about how military advertising and those going to schools to promote the military as a potential career don't talk about necessarily the violence, the negative things. Of course they don't. I mean but there's not much of an explanation of there's not much in the way of theorising that. So I suppose that could be one of my contributions to the literature is how do you theorise that? Well, you look at heterotopian resilience and see it as a means by which it's obscured. The made in is really fascinating. Thank you so much. That's a really interesting. I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about it. And I suppose you mentioned industrialisation. I think you might have done. Yeah.
Well, just as an alternative kind of, well, thinking about it maybe more through the paradigm of how it's what this is doing in terms of absorbing, potentially unemployed youth.
Yeah.
How this might also relate to what the marking of the inness of the national space that's being distinguished from these other global spaces of kind of terrifying forms of value, although also being the ones where that actually holds their, that demonstrate their value, which always sees the kind of, prowess, the travel, etc., etc. But that actually the underlying message might be sign up with the nation, incorporate, join, stay, and that's what, that's kind of what is ultimately significant about the Royal Navy advertising for squadrons. Join up.
Well, no, I think you're right, and of course, I mean, if you look at the target audience, it is, unemployed, insecurely employed, zero contracts, people from the north. I mean, most of the videos of the 12, I think 4 or 5 are, targeting those in the northeast of the UK, which is a kind of poorer region of the country. So I think there's no doubt that, that's the target audience. And I think what I find, if I've understood you correctly, what I think is really important is it's a classic it's not just saying look what you can have, but it's saying look what you haven't got. Here's all the things you haven't got, and it's a pretty shitty life you've got, and here we can prove it by showing you all the stuff that you haven't got. So I think that's quite a nice way to think about it, actually, because and then I got thinking about in and of. So there is a colleague of mine who's written a little bit about this. He's served time in the British Army, and he was and it goes back to the point really about how far you are impacted, your identity is shaped by the military context. Is he always used to say he was in but not of the organisation, and I think that's really interesting. So there is an idea that from the outside potentially individuals or people looking on might assume that you are part of an organisation, but you might just be in it, if that makes makes sense. And I think there are some interesting distinctions. So thanks for that. Yeah, and the interesting question about the kind of militarization, the logistics of civilian transportation. There are a number of things there, but one thing that I've been thinking about is I gave a lecture at the Defence College in the UK a few weeks ago, and the question came up of how future conflicts are going to be fought. And you can disable a nation state's infrastructure by pressing a few buttons on a keyboard, essentially. And that's really where all of this is going in a sense. The military, the aircraft carriers in many ways, I mean, they're one could argue they're completely and utterly redundant even before they've set sail. So I think there is something quite interesting about the materiality of what it is I'm looking at, and thinking forward about how it's almost as if it's just pure nostalgia in a sense, the ways in which these adverts are put together. It's nostalgia for a life in the military that probably won't exist in 50 years the way it does now. But that wasn't what you were asking about. You were asking a little bit about Paul Gilroy. But so Gilroy, I haven't read in full the Black Atlantic, and I will, but again, I've only just come to this. But he's puts a lot of emphasis on the ship as a kind of key vector in empire, but also in lots of other ways as well, connecting identity, return, movement of populations, the slave trade, obviously being the thing he's very interested in. And what I think is interesting about what he's saying is I think he talks about chronotypes, so he's referring to the temporal as well. So I think the temporality is very important here, and I think these videos demonstrate particular kinds of temporality, which I think are also really intriguing, not just the spaces, but the temporal aspects. And in the case of Gilroy, I think what he does really well is he shows that, in terms of, ideas of development of a so-called modern state, the ship was an absolute, hugely important influence on that. It was the first time that you could cross land or sea, but cross territory in this way, or cross space in this way. And for that reason, incredibly enigmatic and important for how we think about the other processes of the empire that might again, and the violence that goes with that might again be lost in this kind of temporal superlative, if you like. So I think that's why I think his work could be important or interesting for us.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions if there are any. Okay, then
Sorry,
yeah.
if there are no others, I realise I'm just sort of jumping in again. When you said that the Navy was trying to sell this concept of self-actualization and being possible in the Navy, I think it's also a reflection of, I went to uni before I joined the Navy. I'm now a young officer, I'm a Southern. And what myself and most of my colleagues at university realised was there was no space for self-actualization, or very little, and everyone was fighting for spots everywhere. And in a country that's essentially turned towards service industry, the space for self-actualization is shrinking. So it's not the Navy saying this is the only way you'll have self-actualization, but this is also, everything I'm saying is my opinion and not like the Navy's opinion. Please don't get me in trouble. But I feel like the concept of self-actualization is a possibility in the Navy. It won't necessarily come true. It's advertised because it is, I feel, easier to attain than it is in the civilian world. I studied law, and I can tell you that about 150 people I studied law with are exactly identical drones fighting for the same positions. Some of them are exceptional people, and they have self-actualized in their interest. But a lot of them are working in Pret a Manger's and just trying to get by, and they're bored and they're doing something else.
Well, I mean, you're kind of going back to your point. Really, is it's incredibly important to have, people with experience of the thing we're talking about. I mean, this is the point. But I think what's But again, my point about self-actualization is not that in the Navy you will be self-actualized or whatever phrase term you want to use. The point is that on the ads are pushing, are promoting, are enticing because they suggest that this possibility is there. And again, I'm sure you've seen the adverts, maybe not if you're in the Navy, but if you watch the adverts, that is what you're seeing. You're seeing people who are transformed, and it's difficult to imagine that they could be even more transformed somehow. So I think there is something very potent in the allure of that self-development in the extreme way, or pinnacle of self-actualization that I think is kind of alluded to, and indeed made quite clear in some of the videos.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Elizabeth, for being here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for your questions, by the way.